Hello there, friends. It's midnight. Today I'm going to be looking at the life expectancy rates for autistic people and talk about why it might be so low. In this video, I will be talking about some serious topics around mental health, and I won't be beating around the bush either. I'll be going through that bush with a chainsaw made up of statistics. I'm not going to be using terms like unalivened to please the algorithm because I need to be really clear about what I'm saying. Okay, so right from the beginning, there is something to make very clear. Being autistic, in and of itself, does not affect life expectancy. There is no link to mysterious brain cancers or heart disease or anything else. It has no effect upon one's physical health. However, whilst different organisations studies will cover about the extent of reduced life expectancy, everyone agrees that autistic people without a learning difficulty, as well as those who do, have a lower than average life expectancy. So in the UK, UCL studied over 17,000 autistic people without a learning difficulty and almost 6,500 who had a learning difficulty through data collected from GPs over 30 years between 1989 and 2019. Like most research around autism, the fact that the majority of people remain undiagnosed means that 9ZL 2024 is not studying the population as a whole, but they acknowledge this and the sample size is good enough to give us a good idea to go on. So, 9ZL 2024 found that autistic men without a learning difficulty had a life expectancy of 74.6 years, and autistic women, also without a learning difficulty, 76.8 years. Now, because this study ended in 2019 and COVID dramatically skewed the data, I'm going to use 2019 life expectancy through the rest of the video. So if we look at the Office of National Statistics between 2017 and 2019, the life expectancy for men, for the population as a whole, was 79.4 years, and for women it was 83.1 years. This means that rounding down, autistic men without learning difficulties die 4 years than 9 months earlier than average, and autistic women die 6 years and 3 months earlier. Whilst I'm not focused on ADHD, I think it's important to mention that the life expectancy appears to be worse. 9to studying over 30,000 ADHD people found that men died on a rough estimate between 6 years and 9 months and 9 years and 1 month earlier, and women died between 6.5 and almost 11 years earlier. Of course, a large proportion of autistic people also have ADHD, which may mean that autistic people have worse life expectancy than the 2024 study suggests. I will add ADHD life expectancy to my list of research and will investigate it properly by itself in more time. Looking at pre-COVID life expectancy around the world, the picture becomes very clear. Autistic men and women in Britain die earlier than the average person in Iran. This is a country under economic sanctions with a GDP per capita a tenth of what it was in Britain in 2019. Other examples from the Middle East include Turkey and Jordan, both of whom had been directly impacted by the humanitarian crisis which was the Syrian civil war, with Turkey taking in 3.2 million refugees and Jordan's population was 7% refugees from Syria. Again, both these countries were significantly poorer than Britain. Jordan's GDP per capita was slightly larger than Iran, but still a tenth of the size, and Turkey's was a quarter. And in both of these countries, life expectancy was higher than for an autistic British person. At this point, we should reiterate that autism does not reduce life expectancy. Professor Josh Stott made it clear when releasing the study that autism itself does not, to our knowledge, directly reduce life expectancy, but we know that autistic people experience health inequalities, meaning that they often don't get the support and help that they need when they need it. And our findings show that some autistic people were dying prematurely, which impacted the overall life expectancy. However, we know that when they have the right support, many autistic people live long, healthy, and happy lives. So, what I'm going to do next is investigate why a healthy subsect of our society dies 5 to 6 years earlier than average. And while I agree with Josh Stott that health inequalities may play a part in this, I think he's also being euphemistic. From what I can tell, there is one thing that explains why autistic people are so likely to live shorter lives than anything else, and that is poor mental health and suicide. The suicide rate for autistic people is astronomical. And it's so bad that we don't really know how bad it is, but I'm going to give it a go. Okay, so autistic are using the old statistics of 1% of people being autistic, which is still relatively useful in terms of discussing diagnosed people, tell us some figures that are horrific but don't surprise me. The headlines are 66% of autistic people have thought about taking their own life, and 35%, over 1 in 3, have attempted suicide. And this means that although diagnosed people are 1% of the population, they make up 15% of the total people who have been hospitalized after an attempt. The reality that the majority of autistic people are undiagnosed gives us an epistemological problem. It becomes very difficult to actually determine what percentage of total suicides are autistic people. In 2022, Cassidy et al. Attempted to answer this question. They looked at 372 coroners' records between 2014 and 2017 and found that 10.8% of people who die by suicide were either diagnosed autistic or considered to be very likely to be undiagnosed autistic based on character traits and interviews with the next of kin. While they compare this with the traditional 1% figure, even if we were to take the top estimate of Nines et al. 2023, where they suggest 2%, but give another estimate of 3, and assuming that Cassidy has successfully acknowledged all of the undiagnosed autistic people, that means that conservatively autistic people are between 3.5 and 5.4 times more likely to kill themselves than a neurotypical person. This is the problem we have with finding out what we know and what we don't know. Because a lot of the data published before 9 et al. 2023, which demonstrated that the autistic population was significantly higher than had been previously thought, relies on diagnosed people and the 1% figure. And so, based on the 1% figure, the data suggests that autistic adults are 9 times as likely and autistic women are 13 times more likely to kill themselves than a neurotypical person. However, as this is based on underestimation of the population, I don't know whether the suicide rate in autistic women is actually higher, or if this is a reflection of the fact that women are notoriously underdiagnosed and there are less diagnosed autistic women, and that the suicide rate is shown more starkly. Fuller and Thompson's research in ADHD which showed that 14% of ADHD people have attempted suicide compared to 2.7% of the Canadian population, suggests that suicide rates in neurodivergent women may be higher than neurodivergent men, as 1 in 4 have attempted suicide rather than 1 in 5 men with ADHD. Unfortunately, I can't interrogate this data properly because it's behind a paywall, which charges me either £41 or £237. The waters are further muddied by research from Samaritans, which shows that whilst men make up 3/4 of suicides, women are far more likely to attempt amongst the general population. This is a situation where misinformation clouds our ability to get an accurate picture, and if we don't really understand the scope of the problem, how could we possibly try to solve it? Is it better than we think, or does a lack of societal understanding about the subtleties of autism, ADHD, and undiagnosed people mean that it might even be worse? What we know is that autistic people kill themselves enough to lower their life expectancy by 5 or 6 years. What causes suicide in autistic people is perhaps a question that I'm not yet qualified to answer, but it is really important to try to get to the bottom of. Viv Dawes, providing written evidence to Parliament in 2023, argued that one of the major causes of suicide is autistic burnout. Now, she does a really good job of describing it, so I'm going to borrow her graphs for this. She is covering a lot of the basis. Not every symptom will be present in every burnout. Every person is different. It presents differently. As we say, I know the term spectrum is misused, but it applies. She describes the main features of burnout as fatigue or extreme exhaustion, increased sensitivity to sensory input, loss of skills such as functional memory, focus, emotional regulation, impulse control, planning and task initiation, increase in mental meltdowns and shutdowns, suicidal thoughts and intrusive thoughts. Burnout might appear to be clinical depression, but it's not. It's very separate. She describes it as having no energy left to mask between the differences in social situations. Often it will significantly affect schoolwork and attendance, and self-care can be significantly affected. She also mentions rarer characteristics of burnout like self-harm and self-medicating, and highlights that burnout might present differently if somebody also has ADHD. As a person who has gone through autistic burnout a number of times, It is hell inside your head, and it can last months or even years, and it will be compounded by its symptoms. For example, the lack of self-care means that other things factor in, from a lack of exercise, poor nutrition, a lack of sleep. The lack of emotional regulation is terrifying, and it feels like you're almost not in control. And I don't want to go too much into my own personal understanding of this, but sometimes I worry that if I have one or two symptoms of burnout, that this might mean that I'm slipping, and that genuinely scares me. And when in reality, I'm just struggling with motivation, I'm procrastinating, but this is a worry I had in the back of my head because of how terrifying it is to be in burnout. Okay, so Vivdors also lists common causes of burnout, such as masking, sensory overload, executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation. So, difficulty with emotional regulation, according to Dawes, can also cause you to lose a skill almost entirely, essentially. High demand environments, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, hormonal changes, so puberty, gender dysphoria, which is something we will look at more in the detail in the future, I promise. Um, Lack of reasonable adjustments, trauma, and undiagnosed autism or ADHD. But the most important point that Dawes makes is that burnout is not caused by autism, but by environments and attitudes that cause autistic people to mask their autism. Autistic brains are not disordered neurotypical brains. Autistic people aren't broken. Autism does not cause burnout or mental health struggles. However, unadjusted, high demand environments and wrong attitudes towards autistic people do. And this leads to autistic masking and sensory overload, which in turn leads to burnout. Which, the sort of thing that's not mentioned here at the end is, which leads to suicide. I strongly agree with her on most of this. I believe that autistic people are responding to a world that is not built for them. Having to change who you are to be accepted every day, all the time, constantly second guessing yourself on social rules and norms which appear entirely arbitrary, would have a negative effect on anyone's mental health. The world is not designed for autistic people, and conforming to act and talk along with the majority to be effectively gaslit about sensory issues for one's entire life, it's enough to affect anyone's mental health, isn't it? Groenetel 2015 and Laertel 2019 both talk about how autistic people have much higher prevalence of mental illness than the general population. Cohen said out of 1,000 autistic adults, 29% had anxiety, 26% depression, and 11% were bipolar. Lyotell took an overview of 96 large studies and came up with slightly lower figures of between 17 and 23% with anxiety, 9 to 17% with sleep disorders, 9 to 13% with depression, and 3 to 6% of bipolar. Both studies also acknowledged higher than average schizophrenia and OCD. But compare this with the general population, the World Health Organization estimates depression at 3.8% globally, and anxiety at 4%, and bipolar at 0.53%. My suspicion is that the higher rates of bipolar may be partly attributable to initial misdiagnosis, especially of autistic women, but it is still dramatically higher. And the high levels of schizophrenia could also be explained in a similar manner, as autism in the 1910s was originally discussed as a symptom of schizophrenia. But the figures around anxiety and depression leave no room for doubt that there is a monumental difference between autistic and neurotypical mental health. I think this video would be far too long if I tried to explain why autistic people face this high level of depression and anxiety, so I'm not going to. Except perhaps to suggest that one of the factors of depression may come from the low socioeconomic condition of autistic people, with an employment rate of 75%, which I have talked about before in the Can Be Bad or Not video. It is important that we acknowledge poor mental health as a factor which causes burnout. I think the most prominent cause of autistic burnout, which is the result of how society is structured specifically, is masking. So Pearson and Rose 2021 looked into why people mask. They concluded that masking is a response to the way people react negatively to autistic traits, and that it is formed through social pressure and trauma in an effort to gain acceptance, and that it may develop subconsciously through internalized ableism. They argued that in order to understand masking, it needs to be acknowledged that autistic people do not develop in a vacuum, but are impacted by collective norms, and that masking is a process formed over years from external pressure. This desire to be accepted plays into another factor of life expectancy, which disadvantages autistic people. Loneliness. Holt-Lunstead 2010 looked at 148 studies, which followed more than 300,000 people over 7.5 years. And they found that people with strong social relationships were 50% more likely to live than people with insufficient social relationships. Holt-Lunstead said that having strong social relationships has the same impact on your life expectancy as quitting smoking. As I have talked about before, experiments like Sasson et al. 2017, Alcaldi et al. 2019, and Butcher et al. 2023 have proven that autistic people are instinctively disliked and judged negatively by neurotypical people in a first impression situation. To recap, these experiments found that from a 10-second video or audio clip of neurotypical and autistic people, neurotypical observers rated autistic people as more awkward, less approachable, and were almost twice as likely to be friends with the neurotypical person than the autistic person. In 2019, again, non-autistics said that autistic people were on average more awkward and less dominant, less intelligent, less empathetic, less likable, and had lower self-esteem. In 2023, Butcher repeated this type of study with autistic children where neurotypical undergrads were shown transcript, audio, and video, and like all these studies, without knowing that some of the children were autistic, rated those children worse, and in this case specified a lack of eye contact as part of their reasoning, which is, as we all know, even GPs, a classic autistic trait. So, the difficulty that autistic people face in building relationships because of these biases and other communication difficulties leads to extreme loneliness. Court et al. 2023, investigating this effect of loneliness on mental and physical health, states that autistic people are 4 times as likely to be lonely. Now, this study puts the emphasis on the difficulties that sensory issues bring to socializing rather than the wider societal rejection that Sasson highlights. But Court is right. Sensory issues also have an impact. Clubbing, for example, is not really desirable for a lot of autistic people because it's loud. As well as the effect that this loneliness has on autistic people, the data from Sasson, Alcaldi, and Butcher's experiments tie into another cause of burnout, which is rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I think it's perfectly reasonable to argue that RSD, although extremely common amongst autistic people, myself included, is not a direct result of autism itself, but a response to constant rejection demonstrated in Sasson et al. And other subsequent studies throughout a person's life. The social isolation that autistic people often face from the rest of society leads to loneliness, which genuinely brings down life expectancy by itself. Humans are social animals, and for all my jokes that I make sometimes about being scared of the humans, and autistic people have the same desire for human connection as anyone else. We find it harder to engage in the common communication standards of body language and tone and subtext, and we prefer communication of direct speech where words are mostly literal. But that doesn't mean that, even if we are uncomfortable in social interactions, even if we don't like them, even if it takes more effort, we still want to be involved. And not being involved, like with anyone else, it affects our life expectancy. Now, this video has been really depressing, but I would like to offer a ray of hope here. Nothing I have said about the life expectancy of autistic people is not fixable here. Both the suicide rates and the loneliness are a product of how society reacts to autistic people. But as I said before, this is learned behavior. It is possible that we can not only make adjustments at schools and workplaces to make burnout less common, we can address the healthcare inequalities when it comes to mental health. We can address the socioeconomic problems that contribute to that mental health. It just comes down to whether there is a political will and a societal understanding in order to do it, and whether it is valued important enough. And that is essentially what I'm going to be arguing for when I'm doing my PhD, because living 5 years less is not something I'm planning on doing, but I could quite easily see how in the past that may have been the case. So I'm going to leave you with a cautiously optimistic message, and I hope I've been informative, and I hope I haven't depressed you all too much. I hope you have a wonderful day, guys.